to Halifax Public Libraries. I have a cold, but I'm going to do my best to project. I'm Osa Katchen. I'm the Chief Librarian and CEO of the library, and I want to welcome all of you here tonight. We are gathered this evening in Chibuktuk and Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And when we think back to the peace and friendship treaties, those treaties recognize the Mi'kmaq people, and they recognize that we would have an ongoing relationship that would be founded on peace and friendship. And we continue every day in our organization and across our community to work toward reconciliation. So I encourage you all to reflect on that every day. I hope many of you today share the joy I felt today at the notice of the significant investment in the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center here in Halifax. So a great federal investment in a very, very important institution in our city. So this is a lovely site and this is a lovely event, and I want to share with you a little personal story. I am a big fan of Canadian literature. My family emigrated, and I think I read my first Alice Munro, having stolen it from my mother's bedside table when I was about 11. We are a country of very gifted writers, and the Giller Prize, the Scotiabank Giller Prize, has been a piece in the fabric of Canadian literature that has acknowledged and recognized excellence. And Jack Rabinovich founded the prize in 1994. The Scotiabank came on board. He named it to honor his late wife, who was a book reviewer and a journalist. And Scotiabank came on board in 2005 to really up the prize and to up the amount of attention that winners got. And money is no small matter. I don't know if we've got a few writers in the room, but every writer I know is not earning a living wage. So thank goodness for these moments of great recognition that comes with money. Now, Jack Rabinovich was a close, lifelong friend of my brother-in-law's, and so I had a chance a couple of times in my life to meet with him and talk about his passion for Canadian literature. And I remember in particular one conversation we had about 7 years ago. We were sitting in the back of a car, and I had attended one of the Giller Between the Pages events across the country, but I paid quite a bit of money to get into that. So he talked about his passion for Canadian writers, and I talked about my passion for libraries as a vehicle to celebrate writing and writers and to bring community together without barriers of cost. And so tonight is a little bit of a culmination of what started in that conversation in the back of the car. So at the library, we love books, but we also love to celebrate the people who write those books. And so, there are lots of people to thank tonight, but, I certainly thank Jack for his vision in setting up this prize so long ago. His daughter, Alana Rabinovich, is the executive director for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. I don't think Alana's here tonight, but she is a heart behind this project. The Scotiabank team have been a great support. I have a great team here at the library who make this magic happen. I arrive and they hand me a microphone and it all works. So thank you to you. And Alexander MacLeod is going to be our host tonight and chatting with these writers. And he's such a friend of this library and a great writer in his own right. So thank you to him. And thank you to all of you for coming and settling in and enjoying this tonight. So, at the library, we consider one of our key responsibilities to connect people in our community to art and culture, and tonight is the realization of that. So welcome, enjoy the evening. I'm as excited as you are to hear from these authors, and so I'm just going to settle in. I'm going to hand it off to Shelby. So thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you, Osa. So just a few housekeeping things before we get started. The bathrooms are located at the top right, just outside that door along the orange wall. Fire exits are located with a green sign. And masks are encouraged but no longer required. So if you brought a snack or beverage with you tonight, please feel free to enjoy. And also, just to give a shout out to our friends at Bookmark, they've brought they've brought all of the shortlisted books here with them tonight, so feel free to give them a visit and you can purchase one of the books, or as many books as you like, of course. So without further ado, let's introduce our guests. Actually, there is one author tonight who couldn't be here. I'm going to introduce them anyway, and then we'll get started with the rest. So, Kim Fu is a Washington-based, Canadian-born fiction writer and poet. She has published 2 other works of fiction, For Today I Am a Boy, and The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore, and a book of poetry, How Festive the Ambulance. Fu was named a writer to watch by CBC Books in 2022. Along with Canadian authors Norma Dunning and Stephen Price, Fu is on the jury for the 2023 CBC Short Story Prize. So, Rawi Hage is a Montreal-based writer. His books include De Niro's Game, which won the International Dublin Literary Award in 2008, Cockroach, which received the Hugh McClelland Prize for Fiction, was defended by Samantha Bee on Canada Reads in 2014, and was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Governor General's Literary Award. Carnival, which was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, and Beirut Hellfire Society, which was on the shortlist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction. Suzette Mayr is a poet and novelist based in Calgary. She is the author of the novels Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall, Monoceros, Moon Honey, and The Widows and Venus Hum. Monoceros won the Relit Award, the City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Book Prize, and made the 2011 Scotiabank Giller Prize longlist. Naga Noor is an Egyptian-Canadian writer. She won the 2017 Bronwyn Wallace Award for her poem, The Mistress and the Ping. She also won the Disquiet Fiction Prize in 2019. In 2020, Noor was named a writer to watch by CBC Books in 2020. Her first book, the poetry collection Washes Praise, was published in 2020 and was named among the best poetry that year by CBC Books. Noor is an instructor at the American University of Cairo. Tsering Yangzom Lama is a Tibetan-Canadian author based in Vancouver. Born and raised in Nepal, she also lived in Toronto and New York City. Lama holds a BA in Creative Writing and International Relations from the University of British Columbia and an MFA from Columbia University. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the Globe and Mail, the Malahat Review, and Grain. We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies is her debut novel. Lama was named a writer to watch by CBC Books in 2022. And our moderator for today is Alexander MacLeod, who was born in Inverness, Cape Breton, and raised in Windsor, Ontario. He is the author of 2 internationally acclaimed books of fiction, Light Lifting, winner of an Atlantic Book Award and a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, the Thomas Head Riddell Fiction Award, and the Commonwealth Book Prize, and Animal Person, which includes the O. Henry Award-winning story Lagomorph, originally published in Granta. MacLeod holds degrees from the University of Windsor, the University of Notre Dame, and McGill. He currently lives in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and teaches at St. Mary's in Halifax. So without further ado, please welcome our guests.
Our effort in this conversation is to be a little smoother than we were in our entrances. We're going to try and coordinate ourselves a little, just a slight bit better than that. But we're not dancers, so this isn't our skill. I really do want to welcome all of you to this place in downtown Halifax. If there was a shirt that says friend of the library, I am indeed a friend of the library, as I suppose all of you are. And I think it's important for people in Halifax just to appreciate everything else we're saying about how special this place is and how lucky we are to have just an evening for us to hang around with the Giller Prize shortlist. People, just ourselves. It's mostly a product of this great library that we have these opportunities, because the library has a real commitment to public discourse and to public space, truly public space. So welcome to this nice place. And congratulations to all of you. The flip side, this is how important the Giller Prize is and how rare it is. So what we're participating in here in this public celebration of reading, public celebration of books, really is fairly unique just to Canadian literature. Every country has a literature, but not every country's literature has a Giller Prize. So just the way that this has become a public celebration of reading and then the power of literature, and as you'll see of quote unquote real books, hard books. I was really proud that you won the Disquieting Prize. What was it called? The Disquietude Prize?
Just disquiet.
The Disquiet Prize. Yeah, so if you've won the Disquiet Prize, you kind of want to put that at the top of your CV. And I'd feel, without too many spoilers, that these books are disquieting in a profound sense. So that's one of the questions that I want to start with. It's mostly an honor to the jurors who produced this list, that these are all works of art. And by that I mean in the real sense. They're doing the work of art, but you got to do some work too when you sit down. They have expectations of readers, which is what I like. There's room for the reader here, for the reader to work. These are not the books that just kind of serve it up. They're profoundly challenging, and they have, I think, a broad sense of what a book is supposed to do. So that's where I'd like to start. You know, a question like that. What's a book supposed to do in the library? I'm wondering if you could all talk a little bit about that in the most general terms. What is a book for? What is a book for? What do you think? Since you wrote some, what's a book for?
I think you should choose the person. That's the way.
Just go this
way? Well, yeah, just name someone.
You get to go first.
Put us on the spot. Put us on the spot, yeah. No. Okay.
I do believe in chat. I actually believe that they want to see the chat.
No.
So what do you think a book's for, Noor? What do you think?
I think what Rawi's saying is you have to call on people and say, Noor, what do you think? And then I'll feel obliged to answer.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that.
No?
Don't feel obligation,
just
jump in.
Rawi, just what do you think? Just do it.
There you go.
What's a book for? What is a book for?
Oh, thank you, Suzette. I'm glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked. Well, I think it's a form of technology that kind of preserve some knowledge, storytelling, etc. Historically, it's a kind of breakthrough way of communicating and preserving thoughts, manuscripts, etc. There's there's something beneficial historically about books. They communicate, they transportable and spread knowledge, etc. On the other hand, they could be dogmatic. I think, coming from the region of 3 major Brahmic religions, I think books set some moralities, and I think they should be held accountable for that. Okay, was that profound? Not, I guess. Okay. Suzette,
the question reminds me a lot, and I love that question, and I love that we're in a library, and a beautiful, beautiful library. It reminds me so much of when I was a kid, and so I was kind of a shyer kid, and there was this library where my brothers and I would go called Alexander Calhoun, and it was really, it was not that close to our house, but we would regularly make the trek to Alexander Calhoun, and we would get like an armload of books, and then we would like schlep through the boiling, through the summer sun, bringing these books home, and it was just, it was in a way it was a horrible experience, but it was so important to have those books. So for me, certainly, when I think of what are books for, I remember that kid, like that 10-year-old who it's like, that was what I did all summer. It was about getting, understanding how other people thought and how other people lived. It was just being in a world other than my own. So I guess I'm saying an escape, but by escape, I don't mean that in a frivolous way. It was, what are other bodies that I could inhabit? What are other experiences that I could have? And so that, I think that's, it probably depends on who the reader is, what are books for, right? But, yeah.
Okay, I guess we're going in order. Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to answer that question. For me, the books that I write, seeing as I think I'm an expert on them, I think I can say, I write them in order to ask a question. So I'm less interested in books as, as a means of transportation or archiving, and more so as a way of posing a really complex, difficult, ethical question. And then sort of, and then I feel that once I've got it out of my system, it's no longer my problem, and it's all of your problems. And it's really a kind of exorcism, and I can move on to other ghosts.
This book is an exorcism. This book is an exorcism. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, in the best way, in the best way.
So I was rewatching the Toni Morrison documentary on Netflix the other night. I don't know if, I think it's available in Canada as well. And I have watched it about 3-4 times. And there's a moment in which she talks about how when we are writing a book, it's not that we have this narrative that we then later have to apply to the book when we're promoting it. Like, I wrote this for this reason. Mm-hmm. You're writing it because you don't know why you're writing it. There's something about the situation, the characters, the time period, an image maybe even, just like Orhan Pamuk has talked about how image is the most important for him. And then you don't know why you're interested in that, and you're writing it to find out why you're interested in that. And for me, that enigma of within yourself is like the reason to write a book. And then later on you have to say, I wrote it for this reason and blah, 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 which is all just marketing. And I mean, I think it's like that Didion quote, that famous Didion quote, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Yep. Or like what Richard Rorty said, which is like, writing is a tool for thinking. Yep. It's a technology.
I write to know, to find out what I know, yeah.
Exactly, it's just how we live, it's how we move through the world. And when you read, while you're looking at text on a page, it's kind of a form of magic that you, as a reader, then are willing, if you are in that state of receptivity and you're willing to do that work, as Alex mentioned, that you're willing to fill in all of the rest into those words, and then create some sort of a connection with the writer across like space and time, which is like magic, I think.
Yep, and this leads directly to, something that I think is quite relevant for this context, is that of course, we're in the middle of a marketing campaign. All of us. Of course we're in the middle of a marketing campaign, but what I think about these works of art is that they resist paraphrase. Like I was just in Vancouver with Kim, and Kim was like, yeah, they write a little paragraph on the front and then a little paragraph about you, and that's it, right? You got like your 5 lines about what your book's about, and then 5 lines about what you're about, and that's it, right? And people are supposed to judge if this is a good or a bad book. But I think these books kind of profoundly resist paraphrase. I said they resist paraphrase. But the world is all about tweets and Instagram, right? So I'm interested, like literally like occupational hazard here, like is what we're doing part of culture? Is it part of our culture? Or are we apart from the culture? Like, is this kind of slow, long engagement with mysterious ethical questions that you're not going to come out of my book like, there it is, done. You're going to come out probably more ponderous or more careful. So I'm wondering, how do you see, like, and I think it works in this context where you're like, I understand that I'm in the middle of a marketing campaign, but at the same time, what I'm doing is not marketing. Like, it's profound. Can we talk a little bit about that?
My turn?
Your remarks will be trademarked. So.
What? Oh. I think there's a big difference between self-representation and self-display. And I think us as writers were very uncomfortable with this whole self-display, and which is necessary of course, in a capitalist society like ours, new technology, etc. Yeah, I think there's a certain compromise for sure. I think there's certain uneasiness, and it's a balance. There's a small element of entertainment, maybe, a bit of humor, etc. But for sure, I think it's not fully comfortable what we're going through now. We're hermetic people who like to hide, I think, in my stereotyping. But that's maybe the attraction towards writer too. They think we're like hiding. And I remember like having a residency in Australia. I end up in the woods somewhere. I'm a very urban guy. I'm afraid of nature, and it was pristine. It was beautiful. But this whole romantic concept of 18th century where Rousseau walking in, is still prevailing. I don't know. I lost my thought, but I'll stop here. Suzette, please.
Oh, great. So the question is, are the books part of culture, or are we part of culture?
What we're doing, like everybody, like I always think when we meet readers, you're like, okay, like when you meet them, you're like, wow, you really exist. Like people really want to do this. The question is like, is writing novels and reading novels in a deep way, is that countercultural? Like, is it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really hard question. It's sort of a discussion, so I teach at the University of Calgary, and it's a discussion I have with students all the time about, the whole idea of literary fiction in quotation marks, which I think is becoming more and more useless as a category. I think there's a lot of cross-pollination happening between the so-called literary and the so-called popular. But I would say that there is, this is a big deal for me. This is huge, and for people I know, but then when I just step out the door and talk to my neighbor, they're like, what are you talking about? It's sort of like, well, what was on Netflix last night? Which is, I'm totally into that. So I worry sometimes that it is about, books becoming part of that whole ivory tower thing. On the other hand, look at this beautiful temple of books, right? And it's like, sure, I think librarians are geniuses, and I'm not just kissing your asses because I'm sitting here.
The library has a Twitter account.
But it's like, how amazing that, librarians figured out that libraries are not just for books, but they're gathering places. You can do your resume, you can do, you can do all kinds of things.
Profound exchange.
Huge space, like an important space. And so, and I think books are kind of becoming the least of it, but kind of not. They're the reason these buildings are here. All of that's to say is that I'm also losing my train of thought. But the thing too, though, is that our books are also really short, and I wonder if that's maybe because
Some
know,
are shorter than others.
short, yeah. Our books are shorter than our books are shorter, you know, and so I wonder if that's. I know it certainly. I don't have the attention span anymore for the 500-page, 700-page book as much as I might try. That's not really answering your question, but it's just
No, it's
throwing
all
out some thoughts,
part
yeah.
of it. I think. Yeah.
All right.
It's going so orderly. Like these chaotic artists are all like A, B, C.
Yeah, I think one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking, Suzette, is the fact that, you know, if you are a musician, say, then part of how other people experience your art is for them to be present in an audience and you sort of play an instrument in front of them. And if you're a painter, then you have an exhibit or whatever, and there's different metaphors, but if you're a writer, then your work is very solitary, and then the experience of it is very solitary. And I mean, you would never have sort of a collective reading of a book. It's a strange concept. And so I think it's lonely for people to experience a book and then feel like, well, I want to talk to someone about this, I want to connect with someone, and so we've kind of created these things called readings and all these events around what is essentially a very solitary experience to try to get that communal feeling that you get from other kinds of art. And I think it's the same sort of with libraries, is, you know, we're all gathering here, individual people, and there's all these individual books, and you can each sit and read your book, but you can do it collectively together. And so I think that's really the conundrum when it comes to literature versus other forms of art, is that we're constantly at this tension of how to, there's such kind of communion on the page, and yet we want to feel that in an embodied way with other people. So that's my not so cynical take on the
Yeah,
truly.
like we're alone when we do it.
Yes.
They're alone, and yet there is this. It's not cynical when.
Yeah, like even if it's a marketing issue, or even if there's something kind of artificial about what brings us all here, we're all here, and it's meaningful to be here.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I feel like I introduced the term marketing into this, and I didn't mean it to take us into this direction.
No.
I think this whole situation is delightful, and as you mentioned, extremely rare. For writers to be treated with this kind of, you know, like this is like unusual, right? I think Noor said it really well in terms of needing communion in an embodied way, gathering as a community to discuss things that we have really engaged with intellectually or emotionally, but then to be in the same space and talk to each other and see each other's faces and to hear each other's voices. And I think this is all very important.
Yes. No, I wasn't. What I'm trying to get at is that inside of all, like, we are skipping the stone across the surface, but of great depths, right? So, like, the depth is there. And by whatever means these books get into people's hands, they do the work. So we are always, of course, like I said, who is more grateful than the writer herself to say, this is all I wanted. All I wanted was for reading to happen. So on that note, I have a question here about scholarship. This is a common theme in these books. There are a lot of smart people in these books, or scholarly people. I'm going to read it to you. One theme that seems common to all your books is something we might vaguely call studying, or maybe scholarship. There's a lot of researching, looking again in these narratives, both inside the stories and outside the texts. Rawi's stray dogs are often professors or photographic experts, in the term academic. He's the academic, is usually used as a derisive insult. Noor does amazing work with the citations and the footnotes, and the last third of this book is the asymmetrical third. The asymmetrical third is a furious, hilarious, devastating metafictional take on the operation of a university fiction workshop. Tsering's Dolma is caught between her own epic intergenerational story of exile and her, quote, ardent wish to be a scholar, and Baxter, the sleeping car porter, longs to study dentistry, is saving up for the tuition, and is always, always reading. And there's a bibliography at the end. Sometimes all this learning and or the desire for study carries characters closer to their families in their native language in a couple of these narratives, and sometimes it separates them from people who maybe aren't of the book, if that makes sense. Can we talk a little bit about the work of interpretation as it's represented in your books, and then maybe a little bit about research and the creative practice? But my primary question is how you're representing reading or interpretation inside your books, because it's in all of them.
I can start, sure. So in my book, there's a sleeping car porter who is, so he's working a train that's going across Canada in 1929. And one thing that was really interesting for me when I was doing the research for this book was that sleeping car porters in general were really educated guys. And it wasn't, you know, some of them had degrees and this was the only job they could get, or the job that, you know, made the most money. But a lot of them, I think, were also autodidacts, you know, so they, and they worked as, they helped transmit knowledge. So they would, you know, get the great jazz records from the South and bring them to the North and distribute them. You know, they would take the newspapers and magazines that passengers had left behind and wrap them up and give them to people. So they were, you know, they were part of the distribution of knowledge and a distribution of art. And so I drew very much from that tradition. So the character Baxter in my book he's very curious, you know, and I think that's what it's about, is about curiosity. And it was really cool, actually. I'm kind of going off into a totally different direction, but it was really cool because I was trying to figure out, you know, what is this character interested in? And for, you know, various reasons, I ended up, he ended up being somebody who was interested in dentistry. And so, I, you know, and as the writer, I thought, okay, well, I should read some dentistry textbooks from 1917. And they were amazing. I mean,
he has a great ability to diagnose everybody's problems.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, sadly, the default kind of dental practice was just get your pliers and yank the tooth out. But, you know, other than that, it was like, it was really interesting to be in the mind of someone who was that curious and curious about things that I otherwise wouldn't care about. Yeah. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but
no, but I think he's like, his curiosity is powering the whole thing, like in all curiosity in the broadest definition.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he's a study of human nature because he had to be in order to figure out how to keep these passengers happy. So everything is text. Everything is something that has to be studied and memorized.
I can chime in. Well, I think in my book, you know, everything, a lot of it is about power. Yeah. So when we talk about interpretation, okay, well, there's a hermeneutics involved in that, and that it comes from a certain tradition. Is it coming from a Western understanding of interpretation? Is it coming from a Tibetan understanding of interpretation? And my characters are caught between these worldviews, and they push against the hegemonic perspective. So Dolma, initially, she's a daughter of refugees and now lives in Toronto. She buys into the Canadian mythos. She wishes to succeed in this country. She wishes to become an academic of her own culture, of Tibetan studies. But of course, Tibetan studies was a Western creation. It was a creation for Westerners by Westerners. And never conceived of Tibetans as being involved in that, as readers of the texts that the Western scholars produced, or even aware one day of that. And now we have a generation of young Tibetans who are entering into academia after their parents were literally begging on the side of the street for food as refugees, which my parents were. And so these Tibetans have pushed their way into academia, and they find themselves inside of a structure that is inherently neocolonial, because Tibetans don't get access to Tibet, which is a colonized country, and because of that, they are lesser scholars. So thinking of the hierarchy of power determined by access, at the very top are, you know, this Chinese government, which has full access to Tibet. And then below that are Western academics and the institutions in the West, like museums, which I also go after, and universities, which I definitely go after. Nobody is like left scot-free in my book. I'm implicating everybody. And then below that are Tibetan people in exile who have the least access to these institutions of power to define the discourse.
And to their own inherited artifacts, to their own history.
Exactly. So then they are now not only disadvantaged in terms of like physical access to their country, they are also delegitimized in these spaces of scholarship that determine who is objective, who can do this study of their own culture. And that is still an ongoing dynamic. I just was at a conference, a Tibetan Studies conference, and hearing about another conference in Paris in which, I mean, the dynamic is rampant, even though right now the optics are a little bit more difficult, right? You can't just have a panel of white scholars talking about Tibet. You gotta throw one brown person in there. But these things are not, we're not in a post-colonial era when it comes to Tibet. We are very much in a colonial era for Tibet, and I wanna talk about Western complicity in that space.
And you have such, I would appreciate it so much when you mentioned the image, because I think you're a crafter of images. So there are some beautiful, like pure images that address exactly this, where I can't do any spoilers, but just like relationships of the internal self and the external land are beautifully rendered in this book.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels between your book, Tsering, and mine, and in that there's a kind of similar dichotomy being created between sort of knowledge production in, for lack of a better word, the East, and knowledge production in the West, and the sort of hierarchy of, you know, who gets to tell what stories in what spaces, in what language, what are the different barriers to accessibility. So my two characters are, one of them is an Egyptian girl who's born and raised in the States and has never been to Egypt, and she sort of goes for the first time. And the other character is an Egyptian guy who's from a small village, doesn't have English, doesn't have education really, despite being sort of self-taught and curious about the world in his own ways, in the ways that he has access to largely through the internet. I was just really curious as to how a story like his could be told. What does it mean to tell it in English? What does it mean to export that story? So very similar kind of concerns of like what happens when you try to, when you remove a narrative that is set in this particular place and ship it overseas, and then try to present it in to this new context that really does not have the tools or the language or the culture to be able to understand the initial dynamics. Yeah.
And when you're talking about that, that's the clearest indicator of power is mobility. So like the people who move this easily with no, like that's just a very interesting, like those who move are powered by something that allows them to move in ways that some of the other characters can't. They don't have this ability. That's a huge theme in your book. Travel and the relationship between the person who can move and the person who can't.
Yeah, but I want to talk about academics.
Talk about academics.
I witnessed, I'm not an academic at all. I consider myself an artist. I was in visual art, but I saw when multidisciplinary started, there was a kind of conversion, and eventually I think academics took hold somehow, introducing jargons and took hold of the art. They became the gatekeeper. Somehow I think literature stayed on the side, but I see now the paradigm is shifting a bit. You see more and more academic. And this is not a resentment or anything, of course. You see more and more academics incorporating literature into their theory. I think literature is becoming more and more within the space of that same kind of university crowd, teachers. It's a form of appropriation in a way. I think they're becoming And this is not a resentment, it's just an observation. Gatekeepers, people who have the jobs, poets, etc. Everything is also converging. I think that might impact the experiential people who lived in certain ways, people who comes from a different background, people who lived stories and actually tell it. There's no binaries here. I think literature is everyone's possession. But I'm also afraid that it might alienate certain experiences. Because I've seen it happening in arts, and especially in galleries. So I think that's why I a little bit POC academics, and there's a lot of academics in my book. I have a very conflicting relationship with academics. I think, in a way, they are this might sound a bit arrogant, but they are my biggest readers. They do read my books. I only know that because so many of their students comes and write theses, especially Cockroach, because it was about immigration and. Yeah, I think there's something. That's all I want to say, actually.
Okay, we'll do one more, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Here's our fake living room. Here's our polite banter. But I think that these books are powered by impolite forces. The impolite forces are money. Let's talk about how much money everybody has or doesn't have. So power as the money, sex, and then the body itself, how the body is experienced, or the body experiences these intersections. So all of your books are interested. These are prominent themes. So can we talk a little bit about the intersection of the political body, I suppose, the political body? Political body? How about the political body, he said in the fake living room. Hey, how about the political body? But also discussions about how money works in all your narratives, and sex on the politicized body. It's all light banter.
Okay. So in my book, so there's the sleeping car porter. He's a closeted gay man who has a very healthy sexual appetite because he's only in his 20s. And so my big struggle in writing that book was in writing a Black man who wouldn't fall into this stereotype of the hypersexualized Black man. So how can you express having a healthy sexuality while being a Black man, a queer man, and not have it fall into that terrible trope? The other thing too that I noticed as well, especially when I was doing research, was that especially at the time, if you had money, you could live your queer lifestyle, right? You could live your queer life. I mean, I know there was one book of photographs that I found, I forget what his first name was, but his last name was Montague. And this was a very wealthy queer man who fell in love with a guy who didn't have as much money, and so pretended to hire him as his chauffeur. And so that's how they lived their lives together, you know? And so money, I mean, I'm interpreting your question in a really literal way, but it's like, you know, when you have money, in certain circumstances, when you have money, it's so much easier to live your life, of course, but also in terms of sexuality, it's way easier to do it. I mean, you just look at, for example, whatever, the left bank in Paris at a certain period of time, and you have people like Natalie Barney, these extremely wealthy queer women who could do whatever they wanted. It just, it was just sort of like they're untouchable. So that doesn't really, I don't know. I want to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about the way that money can sort of facilitate sort of these bridges or make certain things possible for other people who don't have that. I think in Egypt it's such a strange culture because it's, first of all, extremely classist. I mean, in a really amazing way, but that doesn't mean that when you have money you have access to everything, and those who don't have money don't have access to certain spaces. It actually just means that there's a social script for who can be in what spaces, and it goes in both ways. So, and thinking about it in terms of sexuality, there are all kinds of rules for who can love who can sleep with who can be with who. And so, in Egypt, for example, it's actually much easier to live as a queer couple because nobody suspects you. So there's all kinds of ways in which it's not. It can be sort of counterintuitive, like how you can get around these rules. So in the case of my book, you have this one character who is extremely poor, but also provincial. So he's from a village, and that means something different. He's not urban poor. He's not educated, but he has a kind of social currency because of his politics and the role that he took during the revolution. So he does have a kind of power that he's able to wield, and he's also a man in an extremely, patriarchal, misogynist space. In the girl's case, she's coming from the States. She's got sort of foreigner currency, American currency, which she doesn't even realize that she has. I mean, her broken Arabic is also a kind of power in that space. And she doesn't understand the dynamic. She doesn't understand that if she had been born and raised in Egypt, she would never, ever be in a relationship with somebody like this. And so there's a lot of kind of misreading. They're coming from these different spaces. They're in this city, Cairo, both of them newcomers to this city in some ways. And they are not, it's an accident. It's a sort of pure sort of stroke of bad luck that they were able to intersect in this way. And it has to do with money, but it also has to do with all kinds of different measures of power and privilege and knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that resonates with me as well. Like, that privilege, whether it comes from money or whatever other, I guess, identity marker, whether it's your class or your gender or your race, these often have a consequence of creating a certain kind of blindness. I don't know how to get beyond that. I don't know how to get around that, because when you are on the receiving side of the injustice as a result of these dynamics, you see very clearly those dynamics. They're very apparent to you. They're very visible to you. Maybe that's why we're here. Maybe that's why we're talking and why we're writing books and reading books. But the more privilege you have, the more blind you are. And I really believe that books should talk about money and books should talk about class more. I think there's a lot of books that are popular in the US, and I lived in the US for 10 years while writing this book, that almost make no mention of class. Yeah, and that's because literature, the literary production in the US is highly elitist. And I can say this because I lived in New York and I studied at Columbia, so I see the fetish for pedigree, the fetish for that sort of good old days of American sort of academic aristocracy. And yeah, and I think then we create culture that is very like comforting of those ideas. And your original question of like, what is this for? And is it countercultural? Is it just affirming the status quo? And I think a lot of the times it is just affirming the status quo.
Yep.
But I think we're in a particularly important moment right now, especially in Canadian literature, whatever that means. But with the focus on Indigenous literature, the focus on voices that haven't been heard, it's not just like nice because like we haven't heard those voices. It's nice because they're like, I think overall revolutionary. Like they could really disrupt and change some of the deeply rooted mythos that we have about ourselves in this country. And that only comes from like lots of people's voices being given space, and spaces like this, and publishers like kind of getting out of the way or taking a risk, and readers choosing to buy those books. It's so important. I know when I was trying to sell this book, we have these agent mixers at Columbia, which are really horrific, but it's a really fancy canapes and drinks flowing.
What did you say?
Agent mixers.
Agent mixers.
Yeah,
Put all the agents in it.
Yeah, they invite all the literary agents in New York City to come and descend upon the campus, and we meet them in this very fancy library, which has no books. It's called Low Library. It's almost like Roman, the architecture. And you meet them, and I met one agent, and I said, hey, and they're like, what are you working on? And I said, I'm writing a novel about Tibetan exiles. And she said, oh yeah, my colleague tried to sell a memoir by a Tibetan writer, and that didn't work. So, and then she just turned around and walked away.
Pass, yeah.
She like literally.
Hard pass.
And I was like, well, different genre, different writer. Turns
Different
out,
story.
But that's publishing. It's a very conservative space, and they need a comp. They need to know that your book will sell. And if they haven't published an Indigenous book before, if they haven't published an Egyptian novel before in this country, then they have to take a risk. And this is why this is important, to encourage more people to take this.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm reluctant. I don't know. Money. I always associate literature with poor people. I think when you come from places of conflict, you have to write about struggles. When you become an artist, that means you're indulging. You have a certain responsibility. I think the first world do not have it. So when you start, write a book with a few academics in it, you feel odd. I think there's a bit of suspicion, or you're corrupt as a writer. Now you're moving into a different space. You're no longer writing about immediate journalistic event, current event. And I think that's mainly associated with minority writers. It seems like it's our responsibility to talk about that. You might be, have other ideas, you might be a little bit cultured, but that does not mean that you're rich, I remember, you have to forgive me, I'm gonna talk about awards, but I lived through, a few years of awards culture. I was shortlisted for a big German prize, and I didn't get it. Then a year later, I was in Germany. Someone invited me to go to a town outside of Berlin for an event, and he insisted on us taking the train. And he said to me, I have a confession for you. I said, confession from a German. It's a lot to confess. He said, you remember that prize? I said, yes. And he said, well, I was on the jury. I said, oh, well. He said, I loved your book, but I was the one who objected to giving you the prize. I said, why is that? I said, well, strange, but why? He said, because you already won a big award and you have a lot of money. I said, you're right. You know what? I'm glad you didn't give me the books because I would have spent it on alcohol, booze, and gambling and prostitute. So you're doing me a favor. And that's, I'm sure if it was anyone else, they would have. The assumption is that they will corrupt you. It's that kind of savage, the Rousseau, savage novel, savage thing that is expected from us, certain writers.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that is philosophical, you talk about aesthetics, it becomes an indulgence. That's all I have to say.
Agreed. Okay, we can take some questions from the audience for 10 minutes. If you have any, raise your hand and a microphone will fly towards you. That's a plant.
I promise I won't just say flattering things about Noor. Thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. I have a question about the concept of relatability. So I am an academic and teach fiction, and students' reactions to novels often circle around the idea of relatability, whether it's something that they do relate to or don't relate to, or relate to in a way that they didn't expect to relate to. And I guess I'm just always interested in how writers perceive their relationship to relatability in their writing.
That's a good one. What's your relationship to relatability?
I was just going to say, good plant, right? Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. You're like signal. Now.
Oh, okay, all right. I think that what the industry thinks is relatability is very different from what writers think of as relatability. So I think, maybe I'm generalizing on behalf of all of us here, but I feel like for me personally, when you sort of do justice by your characters and by your narrative, if you are able to sort of really capture someone's experience, then it will be relatable across cultures and demographics. I think that the publishing industry, as Tsering was saying earlier, is super conservative because oftentimes you have to jump through all of these different hoops of, an agent has to think your book is relatable, and then an editor has to think your book is relatable, and then, and they can often be sort of unimaginative in who they think your target audience is. I have all kinds of readers who are not Egyptian who feel really drawn and connected to my book and see all kinds of parallels in experiences from other parts of the world. And I feel like, and I also have a lot of Egyptian readers who kind of miss the point. And so, when I think about relatability, I think about books that are able to sort of really honor a particular human experience. And I think the more particular, the more relatable, counterintuitively. But I'm curious.
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that I sort of gave up on years ago, just because I couldn't know what people related to. I have no idea what people relate to. And I think if some writers, if they knew what people related to, well, then they would write those books, because those books would be bestsellers. They'd be instant bestsellers. And so I think I'm more of the school of, and maybe she was lying when she said this, but I think Madonna said, all you can do is, make your art and hope that somebody is on your wavelength, and I kind of feel the same way, which is I'm just going to do my very best. There are I'm going to try to report the truth. So I kind of see myself more as somebody who's reporting on what's going on. I'm going to, the truth, whatever. I mean, of course there is no absolute truth, but what I see as a truth, I'm going to just try to be as loyal to that as possible, even if it is something ugly or strange. and then hope, like just cross my fingers that somebody out there is gonna understand what I'm saying or is going to relate to it. I mean, I'm from Alberta, and I'm a biracial person in Alberta, and I'm a queer person, and so there's not a ton of people like me, so, but I know all about this, so I can write about that, and so hopefully there's somebody out there who, sees some sort of glimmer, is interested for whatever reason.
I'll just channel Kim Fu, who isn't here, because Kim got asked that question, or we were asked that question on a separate panel, and Kim was hilarious. She's like, I'll tell you, people don't know nothing about what's going to be good, right? So she's like, everybody told me that this book that I wrote about the time-traveling frogs and I'm just giving a shout out to Kim's book because she's not here, but it's another amazing book. But she said everyone told her this one's going to be the one that's going to bomb. Like everyone had told her that this was going to be her worst book. Her agents, everyone dissuaded her from doing it, and then it turned out to be by far her most read book. So relatability is interesting that way. Maybe the pros don't know what they're talking about because they have to get a cut like everybody's getting a cut all the way. Okay, one more, and then we have to go.
I'm going to do my best to form this into a question because it's kind of a comment, and it goes back a little bit to the comment on diversity in literature. As a reader of Canadian literature and a really big fan of the Giller Prize, I was personally really thrilled to see the diversity in the long list and the short list this year. Both the diversity of the writers, the books, and also the publishers. There's a lot of indie publishers on the list this year. But there's also a lot of diversity within your books. So kind of going back to the comment about what it means to have voices in this space, being able, the comment about using reading as a way to put yourself into someone else's body and someone else's experience. And all of you didn't necessarily write your characters or your books from specifically your own experience and lens. And so I guess I would just love a comment on sort of that wide range of diversity that there is in these books and in this shortlist this year, from the fact that there's big and small publishers, there's a diverse, shortlisted authors are all diverse, the books are all diverse, and what it is to write from such a diverse sort of view, or write such a diverse story.
Somebody has to say words.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Well, I think it's like the jury, right? You put a certain kind of jury together that probably doesn't resemble juries 15 years ago. This is kind of what happens. And they are drawn to these kinds of stories and these kinds of publishers. And, I think none of our books were the bestsellers or the most known books of the year before that this happened. So this is really speaks to their particular interests, and I think that that's not always the case. That often prizes go to books that are already getting a lot of hype, or shortlists go to really hyped books. So I think that's where credit is due. And I guess the other comment I would make is that I think a lot about what Edward Said wrote in his in Orientalism. He talks about how sometimes there's this effect or there's this belief in a society that if you read books about marginalized people, it'll make you better. It'll have some sort of comforting effect, oh, I'm a good person. I got this, I experienced it, I understand. And that's a narcotizing effect that we definitely don't want, right? Because if just reading the books is the end, then I think literature is purely a bourgeois enterprise, just for people who are already interested in literature to read and sit around thinking about. But I don't believe that books by themselves effect change. you know, there are a lot of poor people, a lot of displaced people that we are writing about who will never read these books, who will never be impacted by these books. The material conditions of these human beings is much more important to me than just expressing something about them. And so I hope that this diversity or diversification or all of these sort of movements that are cultural, that are happening in our society, are not the end, but a means for us to like take action in community, in mutuality, in solidarity with each other, across identities, across backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities, to recognize how our fates are intertwined and to compel us to act when we have so much power.
Amen. I think I'm going to take that opportunity to just thank all of you for your deep and thoughtful answers, right? We do this a lot, but this is really, we rarely get the chance to really dive in and, you know, say what we mean, say what we really think about these issues. And thank you so much for being an attentive audience. Thank you to the library. Thank you to Bookmark, which is our great independent bookstore here. So I won't use the Jack Rabinovich line. He'll be used, or you know, buy all the books. It's cheaper than dinner, whatever the line is. It's do buy these books. Do participate in this great collective act of reading. And tune in. The prize is awarded on November the 7th. It'll be on your TVs. So thanks so much for your support, and thank you all for coming to Halifax.
Thank you.